Hello! In today's video, we will try to answer one big but very important question. Does personality change? And if personality changes, how it happens? So personality development in general can be defined as the continuities, consistencies, and stabilities in people over time and the ways in which people change over time. So there are three important forms of stability which we need to take into account when we discuss personality change and development. The first one is so-called rank order stability. The second one is mean level stability. And the third one is personality coherence. We should consider all three those forms before we can answer this big important question, does personality change in general? So what is rank order stability? So rank order stability is the maintenance of individual position within the group. So for example, if you are extroverted, you're extroverted compared to other people in your, for example, age group. If time flows, you age, and you still the most extroverted person in your cohort group, it means that it's stable. Your rank within the group is stable. So an absolute level of your extroversion can fluctuate. Your position within this group stays stable. This is called rank order stability. So if people tend to maintain their positions on dominance or extroversion, for example, relative to other people over time, then there is a higher rank order stability to those personality characteristics. On the other hand, if people fail to maintain their rank order, for example, submissive people become more dominant or introverted people become more extroverted, then group is displaying rank order instability, or rank order change. It means that people do not maintain the same position, it changes, and those people who were extroverted become more introverted, and people who were introverted become more extroverted, and their ranks changes. So it's a first form of stability. How your personality looks like compared to other people within your group. The second form is so-called mean level stability. So if the average level of some personality trait or attitude, for example, liberalism or conservatism, remains the same over time, it means high level stability. So for example, we measure extroversion in people when they're 20, and we get, for example, 50 points out of 100. And then we measure extroversion 10 years later, and we still get something around 50 points out of 100. It means that mean level stability is very high, very consistent. On the other hand, if mean level changes, for example, it was 50 but became 70 or 30, it means that mean level changed, right? So it's very easy. We just measure something, calculate mean score and standard deviation and compare them. So again, if mean level do not differ significantly over time, then it provides evidence of mean level stability. If mean level changes drastically or slightly, but significantly over time, we say that, oh, it was a mean level change. So very easy. We just need to measure some personality trait or preference before and after and compare to results. And finally, personality coherence. So here it's a bit more tricky one. So it's a bit more complex form of the personality development. It involves changes in the manifestations of the trait. So last video, we discussed that sometimes the trait, the personality trait or disposition stays the same, but the way how we express it might change over time. For example, when small children age 3 get angry, they might fight and scream, but adult people might express their anger in a bit different ways, for example, speaking more aggressively. So an absolute manifestation of anger change, but the underlying trait, for example, being anger-prone, can stay the same, just the manifestation changes based on age and other norms which we might encounter with time. So if we speak about personality coherence, we speak about form of personality development. So maintaining rank order in relation to other individuals, but changing the manifestation of the trait, it's personality coherence. So it involves rank order stability, but manifestation of your trait just changes over time. So personality coherence includes both elements of stability and elements of change in this case, right? Because underlying trait stays the same, but manifestations of the trait change over time, right? So it's three forms of stability or change: rank order stability, mid-level stability, and personality coherence, right? So does personality change? Again, returning to our big question for today's video. In sum, we can say that personality change has two defining qualities. So if we make a conclusion that personality changed, we speak about two things. First, the changes are typically internal to a person, right? Because if changes are external, we don't think the personality changed. We say the situation changed, the life circumstances changed, and so on. But when we speak about like personality change, we imply that it's internal to a person, right? So it's different. And the second implication here is that changes are relatively enduring over time, right? So it's, again, self-obvious, but still we need to speak about that. So if changes your personality had last only a couple of days, right? We suppose it's temporary. We don't say your personality changed. We say that your mood changed or your behavior was different in this situation, but overall your personality stayed the same. So we need to observe and confirm that personality changes were relatively enduring over time and lasted for quite some time before we can make a definitive conclusion that personality changed. Yes, personality changed, not behavioral change, not mood change, not external change. So it's important to meet both criteria here to make a definitive conclusion that personality really changed. So, but again, the question is not that simple. So before we answer this question, does personality change? We also need to speak about three levels of analysis. So population as a whole, group differences, and individual differences within groups. Because if we speak about personality change, we can compare this change to, right, population, to your group, which you belong to, and individual differences. So it would be three levels of analysis, and because that level of analysis would be different, the answer to the question also might be different, and we need to take this to account. So when we speak about the population as a whole, we speak about things which are typical for all people because we belong to the same species, Homo sapiens, right? So an example of personality change and development on this level, population level of analysis, would be famous Erikson stages of psychosocial development, which you probably studied in Introduction to Psychology and human development courses. So several personality psychologists, including Erikson, theorized about the changes that we all go through in navigating from infancy to adulthood, which would be the same for all people in the world. So this level of personality development deals with the changes and constancies that apply more or less to all people. That is why it's population level of analysis. The group differences level compares different groups of people. It might be ethnic groups or sex groups or age groups and so on, people with different political beliefs. So some changes over time affect different groups of people differently. So one example is the sex differences. Other group differences may include, as I said, cultural or ethnic group differences. Here on the picture, you see a funny question, why Russians don't smile. This is actually true. So for Russian culture, smiling to a stranger, the person you don't know, is considered to be inappropriate. People don't do that. But in North America, in the United States and Canada, people usually smile to strangers because it's considered just to be polite, right? So it's a small difference, but you can distinguish people who belong to two different types of culture here based on this small behavioral example. But there are much more drastic differences between groups of people if you conduct a proper psychological assessment. And we can compare groups of people based on their personality traits and try to answer questions why they differ and how they change. And finally, individual differences level. Here, psychologists usually try to answer the following questions. Can we predict, based on the personalities, which individuals will go through a midlife crisis? So if we know a personality traits of a person, age 20, for example, can we predict what will happen in next 20 years? Will this person go through a midlife crisis or not, based on the information about personality traits we already have? Can we predict who will be at risk for a psychological disturbance later in life based on earlier measures of personality? So again, we measure several personality characteristics. Can we predict which people will face more stress and problems and will need more help in psychological counseling in future, for example? And can we predict which individuals will change over time and which ones will remain the same? So not all people equally change with age. Some people show more consistency in their personality, while other people change more and sometimes drastically. So can we predict that and why does it happen? So individual differences level is presented by such types of questions and psychologists try to answer them. So currently we will stay on this level of analysis when we will try to answer question about does personality change or not. One example is so-called temperamental differences. So temperament is individual differences that emerge very early in life and likely to have a heritable basis. So it's genetical predisposition and often involved with emotionality and arousability. It's just basically properties of nervous system. So it has a strong psychophysiological basis and depends on genetics. So people are just born with different levels of emotionality and arousability. And if you're basically born with this level of emotionality and arousability you have as an infant, probably it will stay almost the same until the rest of your life. It is called temperament. So Mary Rothbard, you can see her photo on this on the slide, studied infants at different ages, starting at 3 months of age, which I should say is very hard to study, such as small participants. So young participants. She examined 6 factors of temperament using ratings completed by caregivers. So obviously, babies cannot answer psychological tests, but they have caregivers. The most typical one are, for example, mother and father, but it could be different figures who replace them. They observe behavior and of these children and can answer questions. And basically, we can see very early how different infants are. So what are the 6 factors of temperament? So how can we compare temperamental differences between children in this example? The first factor is so-called activity level, the infant overall motor activity, including arm and leg movements. So infants basically differ on the activity level. So some infants move a lot while others stay relatively stable. They don't like to move much. Smiling and laughter, another difference. So some infants generally more tend to show more smiles and they laugh more often, while other infants may be more serious or even grumpy. Fear response is a third factor, also very different. So even at 3 months old, infants already show different reactions toward distress and they express fear very differently. So some of them like novelty and new stimulation, while others are prone to be scared of new. So it's rather different. So distress to limitations. The child's distress at being refused food, being dressed, and being confined or being prevented access to a desired object, right? So the part of caregiving is physical nurturance, right? So we need to clothe babies, we need to feed them, and we need to be very careful with safety, their safety. And children respond to this very differently. So the reaction toward possible limitations might be very different. So based on irascibility and emotionality again. Suitability, so how children cope with stress. So can they reduce stress and calm down or not when they are soothed by their caregivers. So usually good caregivers try to calm down children when they distress, saying some nice words, taking their hands, trying to shake them a bit, and so on, just to provide emotional support. And again, some children calm down very fast and some children not. It's, again, a temperamental difference. And finally, duration of orienting. So the degree to which the child sustains attention to object in the absence of sudden changes, right? So obviously, sudden changes grasp attention involuntarily. But what happens if nothing happens? Does the child stays attentive to something or not? So it's again connected to the properties of nervous system, has psychophysiological basis, and thus it's also considered to be a part of temperamental differences. So based on these 6 small criteria, we can detect differences between children very early as 3 months. And basically, it doesn't change much. So temperament is considered to be very stable over time. And based on those properties of arousability and emotionality, people tend to start their life with a bit different starting point in their perception and early experiences, which result in getting more and more differences over time. So Rothbard and her colleagues came to the following conclusions in their research of temperamental differences. So first, stable individual differences appear to emerge very early in life, as I said, when they can be assessed by observers who know those children. Second, for most temperament variables, there are moderate levels of stability over time during the first year of life. And the stability of temperament tends to be higher over short intervals of time than over long intervals of time, which is self-obvious, right? So the more distance between observations, the more possible differences can possibly happen. And fourth, the level of stability of temperament tends to increase as infants mature. So the older children get, less likely temperament will change. So it again doesn't sound revolutionary, but it's an important evidence-based confirmation of those ideas provided by Rothbard and her colleagues. So again, individual differences in personality emerge very early in life, and it's not only temperamental differences. So another example is aggression. So basically, how you're prone to be aggressive or not, or more friendly, is also can be tracked very early in life, and we can detect this in a very small children. So these individual differences, like aggression, temperament, or else, tend to be moderately stable over time, so that people who are high on a particular trait tend to remain high later in life. So personality change at age 3, so being a toddler, tends to be a good predictor of adult personality at age 26. Right? It's actually an astonishing result, but in most cases, many of your personality traits you had at the age 3 will remain almost the same at the age of 26. But manifestation of those traits, as we discussed earlier, can change dramatically, right? You learn how to deal with your own personality and what is appropriate expression of personality traits for your age, socioeconomic status, and culture. So finally, the stability coefficients gradually decline over time as the distance between testing increases. So again, it's very logical. The more distance between the situations of testing, the more possible changes can happen in this period of time. So that is why stability coefficients gradually decline. So if we will measure personality at age 3, it would be a worse predictor for personality at age 35 than for age 26, right? So I think it's very clear. What is about rank order stability and mean level stability in adulthood? Let's start with rank order stability. So across self-report measures of personality conducted by different investigators and over different time intervals of adulthood, we know that traits of neuroticism, extroversion, openness to new experience, agreeableness, and conscientiousness, so all 5 traits from the Big 5 theory we discussed in last videos, show moderate or high levels of stability. So they stay relatively the same, moderate and high levels of stability. The average correlation across these traits is roughly 0.65. So it's actually a lot for personality psychology. So when it comes to this complex reality we call a personality, getting such correlations in average is a pretty high result. So it's between moderate and high level correlation. So in some personality dispositions, whether the standard Big 5 or some other dispositions, show moderate to considerable rank over stability over time in adulthood. So it means if you score, for example, high on agreeableness when you're 20, compared to other people of your age, probably you will stay high on agreeableness compared to the same people 30 years after, right? So for some people it changes, but in average, if we take the population, right, it's relatively stable, moderate or high level of stability. So the question here, one interesting question is, when does personality consistency peak? So when your personality reach a point in your life when your traits become so firm that they won't change much relative to other people. So when your personality becomes more like stable and maybe a bit rigid, so at which age it happens? So personality psychologists try to tackle this problem, answer this question for quite some time. And intuitively, a lot of people think it happens in late 20s, maybe early 30s, but the actual result is different. So in big research, Roberts and Del Vecchio, 24 years ago, conducted a huge meta-analysis research of 152 longitudinal studies of personality. So it's a lot of data. They try to make a meta-analysis and in attempt to understand what actually happens. So, and they got that personality consistency tends to increase with increasing age. For example, the average personality consistency during the teenage years was only 0.47, but it jumped on 10% in 20s and reached a 0.62 in 30s. So the older you get, the more consistent your personality becomes. So less likely you will change. And what is interesting, personality consistency peaked during the decade of the 50s. So it's later than most of researchers hypothesized about that. So it reached 0.75 consistency rate. So the peak of your personality consistency, again, the point where your personality traits become like super firm, is around age 50. So much later than most of psychologists think it will be. So it's an interesting research here. Speaking about mean level of stability in adulthood, studies confirm that mean level personality traits change in slight but important ways during adulthood. So the absolute level of different personality traits changes in adulthood. It's not rigid, not super stable. Most consistent change, people tend to score lower on neuroticism and negative affect as they grow older. So the older you get, the lower levels of neuroticism you have. Probably it is connected with getting more life experience and developing better coping skills, and sometimes getting a counseling or psychotherapy services. So people who score high on neuroticism suffer from more negative emotions, and they distressed more easily compared to people who score high on emotional stability. So they get irritated, upset, sad, angry, or anxious much more easily. And the stimulation they need to get this sad, upset, anxious, and so on is much weaker compared to emotionally stable people. And people tend to develop more coping mechanisms and learn how to deal with that when they're age. And probably because of that, they score lower on neuroticism and negative affect as they get older. A massive meta-analysis of 92 different samples found that both women and men gradually become more emotionally stable, with the largest changes occurring between the ages 22 and 40. So in this adulthood, early adulthood and mid-adulthood stage, both men and women tend to develop new copings and learn how to deal with these negative affects in their neuroticism and become gradually much more stable, emotional stable. And another difference is traits of agreeableness and conscientiousness. Here, people score higher on them when they're age. It's also interesting. So, agreeableness means being interested in cooperation, being more friendly, tendency to find a compromise instead of, being conflicted with being in a conflict with other people. And conscientiousness is connected to higher self-control skills, being able to work on schedule, following rules. So people tend to score higher and higher on these traits when they're age. Probably it's also connected with getting more life experience. So even people who are more impulsive learn how to meet deadlines and follow the rules, develop a bit higher level of conscientiousness. And people who score less on agreeableness learn that sometimes being agreeable is a good strategy, how to get along with other people, and try to develop a bit of change in this respect as well. So finally, the big five personality dispositions may be changeable through therapy. So it's a good and interesting result. So people who go to psychotherapy actually can change their personality traits profile, at least when we speak about the big five traits, which is interesting. So, and again, the biggest impact of psychotherapy is on neuroticism and emotional instability, which is, I think, quite obvious. And it brings us to the question, can we change our personality on purpose? So, does volitional personality change possible or not? So one of the most challenging questions for researcher is, can people intentionally change their personality if they decide to do so? So, for example, can an extroverted person become introverted if they have such a purpose? Or emotionally unstable person can become emotionally stable or not? So this is a tricky question. Hudson and Fraley in 2015 set out to examine this very question in their quite an interesting research, which I want to tell you about. So basically, they conducted two experiments with undergraduate students in order to examine, is it possible to voluntarily change your personality? Basically, they measured big five traits as a possible metric of change. So with coaching of some small realistic steps toward making those changes, including setting specific goals to implement change on a daily basis. So students who expressed goals to increase any big five trait at the start of the period tended to experience actual increases in the trait over 16-week period. So it's a one whole semester. So it was demonstrated by both self-report measures and daily behaviors associated with the traits. So obviously they couldn't use only self-report data because students who express willingness to change their personality would be a bit biased in this regard. So they also used an observer data here to confirm that the change actually happens. So, and people who set practical intentions for change were more successful in this. So if you really, really want to change your personality traits and you have a real plan with possible steps, starting small, and you show consistency in this intention, you actually can change your personality traits on Big Five, at least in some range, which is actually a very interesting result because a lot of personality psychologists before that supposed it's not very plausible. So, and it brings us to one last question. So we already answered that yes, personality change is possible. It implies internal change and it should be endurable. So it should be shown during quite some time. It is possible we can consider this through different forms of change, such as rank order stability, mean level stability, and personality coherence. And we discussed, is it possible to change your personality on purpose? Yes. So now we need to answer the question, how different personality characteristics connected to different life outcomes. Here I decided to focus on the question of health and longevity. So the most important traits conducive to living a long life are, so if you want to have a long life, it's correlated with high conscientiousness, positive emotionality and extroversion, and low levels of hostility and neuroticism. So it has a bit different explanations. So, for example, people who score high on conscientiousness because they follow the rules, for example, they drive more safely and they're less prone to abuse different substances, including alcohol, which obviously positively affects their health. People who score lower on neuroticism and have positive emotionality have less stress, so their immune system less affected. They have less colds and flus and so on, which also positively influence their health. And low levels of hostility help to maintain better relationships with other people, which is also shown to be a positive factor which affects your health. So conscientious individuals also engage in more health-promoting practices. It's easier for them to follow a good diet or get a regular exercise because their self-control skills are more developed. And as I said, they avoid unhealthy practices. So it's obviously a good factor. Conscientiousness worth developing. Extroverts are more likely to have lots of friends, and which results in a better social support network. So more people who can help you if you face different life challenges and problems, from emotional support to financial support and just actual help, which helps to improve health as well. So, and low levels of hostility as a component of neuroticism put less stress on the heart and cardiovascular system. So high level of hostility, which is typical for type A people, show very high correlation with cardiovascular disorders. So on the contrary, low levels of hostility is a good predictor of better cardiovascular system conditions. So that's an interesting, not obvious result, but being hostile to other people is not the best, not only in terms of ethics, but also it's bad for your health as well. So thank you for watching this video. See you next time, and we will discuss a new domain in personality psychology, so-called biological domain of personality. Thank you.